The first time I realized I might not be alone in the Appalachian Mountains, I was sitting inside my tent at 2 a.m, listening to somebody slowly walking around it. I had been camping alone for 3 nights, and until that point, nothing had happened that I would have considered genuinely strange. I was 29 at the time, and I had been doing solo camping trips for several years. I was not an expert outdoorsman, but I knew how to read a map, start a fire, keep food secured, and recognize the difference between normal wildlife activity and something that deserved attention. The trip was supposed to be 4 nights. I had taken time off work in October and driven into western North Carolina, planning to spend most of the trip hiking and sleeping at dispersed campsites away from the busier campgrounds. The weather was perfect, cold at night, comfortable during the day, with almost no wind. The first 2 nights were completely uneventful. I cooked dinner, read for a while, and usually went to sleep around 10:30 in the evening. My campsite was several miles from the nearest paved road. There were no electrical hookups, no bathrooms, and no other campers that I could see. That isolation was exactly what I wanted. On the 3rd night, I went to sleep shortly after 11. I remember waking up because I heard a branch snap. That was not unusual. The woods were full of sounds at night. Leaves moved, branches fell, animals walked through the undergrowth. I stayed still for a few seconds and listened. Nothing. Then I heard another branch snap. This one sounded closer. I checked my phone. 2:12 in the morning. I considered getting out of the tent and looking around, but decided against it. I had a small flashlight beside my sleeping bag, and I turned it on without leaving the tent. The light was barely enough to illuminate the inside. I switched it off. A few seconds later, I heard footsteps. Slow footsteps. They were coming from somewhere behind my tent. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. Pause. At first, I convinced myself it was an animal. Then the footsteps stopped. I waited. Nothing happened. Then they started again. This time, they were moving around the left side of my tent. I could hear the leaves compressing underneath whoever was walking. The steps were too slow to sound like a deer. Too deliberate. I reached for my phone and turned off the sound completely. Then I heard something that made my stomach tighten. A man's voice. Very quietly from somewhere outside. "Hello?" I did not answer. There was a long silence. Then he said it again. "Anybody in there?" I remember staring at the fabric of the tent, because I was trying to convince myself that I had misunderstood him. I had not. Someone was standing outside. I slowly reached for my phone and opened the emergency call screen. I did not press it yet. I wanted to know where the person was. The footsteps moved again. They went around the front of the tent, then stopped. I could see the faint shadow of someone's legs through the fabric. The person stood there for several seconds. Then he walked away. I waited nearly 10 minutes before moving. I finally called emergency services and quietly explained where I was. Because I was in a remote area, the dispatcher told me to remain inside the tent, keep my phone available, and avoid confronting the person. That was exactly what I intended to do. About 20 minutes later, I heard a vehicle in the distance, then another. A ranger and a sheriff's deputy eventually reached the area. They found footprints around my campsite. There were several sets. The footprints were not animal tracks. They were from boots. The deputy asked whether I knew anyone who might have followed me. I said no. He asked whether I had seen anyone earlier that day. Again, no. Then he asked me something that I had not considered. "Did you notice anybody watching you on the drive-in?" I thought about it. And suddenly, I remembered a dark pickup truck. I had seen it twice that afternoon. The first time, it was parked near a trailhead. The second time, it was behind me on a narrow road. I had not thought anything of it. The deputy wrote down the description. They searched the surrounding area but did not find the person. I packed my things and spent the rest of the night inside my locked vehicle. The next morning, I drove out. I did not sleep at that campsite again. A few months later, I received a call from the sheriff's office. They had stopped someone in the same general area for an unrelated reason. The man had been camping illegally and had several previous arrests for trespassing. The deputy could not confirm that he was the person outside my tent. There was no evidence strong enough to make that connection. So technically, I still do not know who was standing outside my tent that night, but I know someone was there. And I know he had walked around my campsite without making enough noise for me to notice until he was already close. That was my first experience camping alone in the Appalachian Mountains. I wish it had been my last. It was not. The second incident happened about a year later. By then I had changed the way I camped. I carried a satellite communication device. I kept my keys beside me when I slept. I never left food outside. And I became much more careful about telling people exactly where I planned to camp. Ironically, the second incident happened at a developed campground. It was late September, and I had driven into Tennessee for a weekend trip. The campground was surrounded by mountains and forest, but there were enough people around that I felt completely comfortable. There were families, hikers, a few older couples with recreational vehicles, several groups of college students. I had a small tent near the edge of the campground. The first night was normal. The second evening, I noticed a man sitting alone near the road. He looked to be in his 40s, baseball cap, dark jacket, work boots. He was sitting beside an older pickup truck. I did not think anything of him. Around 8 in the evening, I walked toward the restroom. When I came back, he was standing near my campsite. I assumed he had mistaken it for someone else's. He looked at me and said, "You alone?" I laughed awkwardly and said yes. He smiled. "That's brave." I shrugged. He asked where I was from. I gave him a vague answer. Then he asked how many nights I planned to stay. That question bothered me. I told him I was leaving the next morning. That was a lie. I planned to stay another 2 nights. He nodded and walked away. I watched him return to his truck. For the next hour, nothing happened. Then I noticed his truck had moved. It was now parked farther down the campground, closer to my site. I told myself there was probably an innocent explanation. Maybe another vehicle had taken his previous spot. Maybe he was moving closer to someone he knew. I ignored it. Around 11, I went inside my tent. I was almost asleep when I heard footsteps. They stopped near my tent. I held my breath. Then I heard a zipper. Not my zipper. Another tent. Somewhere nearby. I relaxed slightly. Probably another camper. Then I heard a voice. "Hey." I did not answer. "Hey, man." The voice came from outside my tent. I recognized it. It was the man from earlier. I said, "What?" He replied, "You got a light?" I told him no. There was silence. Then he said, "You sure?" I sat up. "Yeah." He laughed quietly. "All right." His footsteps moved away. I waited. A few minutes passed. Then I heard something scrape against the ground outside. I reached for my phone. The sound came again. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. I slowly unzipped the inner part of my tent just enough to look outside. The man was standing near my cooler. He had not seen me. He bent down. He picked up the cooler. Then he started walking toward the woods. I opened my tent and yelled, "Hey!" He dropped the cooler. He looked at me. For a second, neither of us moved. Then he said, "I thought it was mine." I said, "It has my name on it." He looked down. My name was written across the lid in permanent marker. He smiled. Guess I was mistaken. Then he walked away. I immediately called the campground host. The host came over with another employee. I explained what happened. They asked me to describe the man and his truck. Then they told me something that made me feel much less comfortable. He was not registered at the campground. His truck had been there for 2 nights. They called law enforcement. The man was gone by the time officers arrived. The officers searched the area, but did not find him. I decided to leave. While I was packing, the campground employee found something beside my tent. It was a small folding knife. I had never seen it before. The employee immediately told me not to touch it. The officers photographed it and collected it. I do not know whether it belonged to the man. There were no fingerprints they could use. I never saw him again. But what bothered me most was that he had known I was alone. He had asked me, and I had answered. That was a mistake I never made again. The third story happened on a completely different trip. This one scared me more than either of the others because I did not realize I was being followed until it was almost too late. I was hiking alone near the North Carolina and Tennessee border. It was early November. The leaves were mostly gone, and the trails were covered with damp brown leaves that made every footstep audible. I started hiking shortly after sunrise. The trail was not particularly difficult. I expected to finish the hike by early afternoon and return to my vehicle before dark. About an hour into the hike, I noticed another man ahead of me. He was wearing a gray sweatshirt and carrying a black backpack. Nothing unusual. He looked like another hiker. I passed him after a few minutes. He stepped aside and let me go ahead. I nodded. He said, "Morning." I said, "Morning." That was the entire interaction. About 20 minutes later, I looked back. He was behind me again. I thought maybe he had taken a shortcut. I continued walking. 10 minutes later, I stopped to drink water. He stopped too. That was when I became suspicious. I started walking again. He started walking again. I stopped at another trail junction. He stopped at the same junction. I finally turned around and asked, "Are you heading toward the overlook?" He said yes. I asked whether he knew the trail. He smiled and said, "Pretty well." Then he asked, "You camping out here?" I said no. Another lie. He nodded and walked past me. For the next several minutes, he remained ahead of me. Then he disappeared around a bend. I kept walking. About 5 minutes later, I reached another junction. There was no sign of him. I checked the map. The trail split in two. One direction led toward the overlook. The other led toward a parking area. I decided to take the parking route. I wanted to end the hike. As I walked, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around. The man was there. He was walking quickly. I stepped off the trail and let him pass. He stopped. I said, "Go ahead." He looked at me. Then he said, "Why are you stopping?" I told him I was checking my phone. He stared at me for several seconds. Then he continued walking. I waited. He disappeared around the bend. I counted to 30. Then I walked in the opposite direction. I had no intention of following him. I wanted to create distance. After several minutes, I heard something behind me. A whistle. I turned. Nobody. Then another whistle. This time closer. I started walking faster. The trail became narrower. I could hear footsteps behind me. I did not look back again. I took my phone out and activated the emergency feature on my satellite communicator. Then I sent my location to my brother. I also called emergency services. I explained that I believed another hiker was following me. The dispatcher kept me on the line. The problem was that there was almost no cell service. The call kept breaking up. I reached a rocky section where the trail descended toward a creek. I heard the man behind me. Then he shouted, "Hey!" I kept walking. "Wait." I did not. He shouted again. "Why are you running?" I started running. I slipped once. I caught myself against a tree and kept going. The trail eventually opened into a wider area. I could see the parking lot. There were 2 vehicles. One belonged to another hiker. The other was a parked vehicle. I ran toward them. A ranger was standing beside the vehicle. I shouted that someone was following me. The ranger immediately told me to get inside his vehicle. The man appeared about 30 seconds later. He stopped when he saw the ranger. The ranger asked him to remain where he was. The man immediately became defensive. He said I had misunderstood him. He said he was just hiking the same trail. The ranger asked him for identification. He provided it. Another officer arrived shortly afterward. They separated us. I explained everything. The man insisted that he had no idea I was uncomfortable. The officer checked his backpack. They found a pair of binoculars, several zip ties, a folding knife, and a second phone. None of those things were illegal by themselves. There was no proof he intended to hurt me. But the officers decided to search his vehicle. Inside, they found photographs. Not of me. They were pictures of several different people hiking on trails in the area. The photos appeared to have been taken from a distance. That changed the entire situation. The man was detained while investigators looked into the photographs. I was allowed to leave. I never found out exactly what happened to him afterward. The ranger told me that the investigation was ongoing. What I do know is that I had spent almost 2 hours assuming I was simply being paranoid. Every time I saw him, I gave him another explanation. He was another hiker. He had taken a shortcut. He was going the same direction. He was just curious. He was not necessarily dangerous. Maybe all of those explanations could have been true, but the moment I realized he was changing his behavior based on mine, I knew something was wrong. That was the lesson I took from those trips. The Appalachian Mountains are beautiful. They can also be incredibly isolated, and isolation changes the consequences of a bad decision. The most dangerous thing I did on any of those trips was not hiking alone. It was ignoring the small things because I did not want to feel afraid. I used to think being cautious meant assuming everyone was dangerous. Now I think it means paying attention when something does not make sense. I still camp. I still hike. But I do not camp the way I used to. I tell someone exactly where I am going. I carry a communication device. I keep my vehicle keys within reach. I never tell strangers that I am alone. And if someone makes me uncomfortable, I leave before I have enough evidence to convince myself that I am being unreasonable. Because the thing I remember most from those nights is not the darkness. It is how easy it was to explain away the warning signs while they were happening. And sometimes, by the time you stop explaining them away, the person causing them is already standing much closer than you realized.